When we talk about what context is in JavaScript, what we're really talking about is what does the word this end up pointing to? So let's actually do a couple of quick examples here. I've got a web page here, and I'm going to do a console.log of this. And I'm going to refresh my page, and I'll see that this is the window object. In fact, if I ask the question, is it exactly the window object? Does this point to the window object? It'll end up telling me true. So you might think this always points to the window object, and that could maybe even be a good guess, because if we were to write a function called foo, and we were to console.log this, and I were to end up calling foo, I would find again that this within the foo object is, again, the window object. So the question is, when will this point to something other than the window object? Well, let's take an example here. I'm going to put a button on the page that says click me. And what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to add an event handler to this. I'm going to grab my button, and this is going to be document query selector, and I'm just going to grab button here. And I'll add an event listener. And I'm going to add the click event. I'm going to subscribe to the click event, and I'm going to do it. Notice I'm going to use this fat arrow function. And I'm going to console log this, and I'm hoping that I get something other than the window object. And if I click on this, well, I'm very upset because I still can't get past this being the window object. But what if I make one change here? What if instead of using this fat arrow syntax, I put in the word function? Sometimes we think these things are the exact same thing, but in fact, now when I click on this, it tells me that this is my button. And the reason why that works is that when I have a regular function here, this function ends up getting bound. I don't call this function gets called for me. And in fact, since it was set up as an event listener for the button, it ends up getting called, and the context that ends up getting passed to this, and this is something that can end up being controlled, but the theory is that, hey, look, if you clicked on the button, you might want to access the button. Now, I could access this button anyway by going over here and saying ev.target. These will end up being the same thing. But if I use the function keyword, I can end up accessing it with the word this. Again, might not be the biggest deal in the world, but actually we've seen now that we can have a this, which is other than the window object. Let's take one more example. Let's create an object. And I've got the foo object. Bar is going to be the string baz. But I'm also going to have quug, which is going to be a function. And what I'm going to do here in my function is I'm just going to console.log this. And I'm going to call foo quug. And if I do that, what it'll end up telling me is that in that case, this ends up pointing to this thing that called this method. So when you have an object and the object has a method, right, this by default, if this object is calling this method, it's bound to the object. Now, again, I could break this by using the arrow syntax, in which case I'm going to be back again to my window object. I think that's actually important here, is that if I did want this to be bound, and I very well might want it to be bound, one of the things that I might want to do is, let's just say that I kind of strip this out, and I end up creating another variable, and I'm going to call this variable q, and this is going to be q foo.quug. So I'm going to pull this function out, or I'm going to reference this function, but really just as a naked function, just as a function. Now if I do this, so let me just call it. Now when I end up running this, again, I'm back to my window object. Now this is something that we can end up controlling, but we learned a couple of things here. We learned that We can have this, which is other than the window object. It'll end up happening when we have event handlers for buttons, or when we have an object and that object calls a method of itself by default, and it's not going to be f, it's going to be foo, we'll actually be able to have a different context. The next thing we'll look at is how we can end up controlling the context. So at this point, it seems like the context is what it is. Maybe when we end up, using function as opposed to the arrow function, we have a little bit more control, but we actually have full control over what this ends up pointing to when we use this function keyword. And that's what we'll take a look at next.